Jewish ethics strongly favors a legal or commandment-style emphasis. It is not up to the individual to decide what is ethically right or wrong, because it has all already been predetermined by the law. The only means of interpretation is just how to apply these ancient laws to modern situations. The basis of Jewish ethics are the Ten Commandments. There are also, however, two versions of the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew Bible, considered to be from two different sources and written at different times. Beyond the Ten Commandments, there are 613 mitzvot, which are additional rules or laws that Jews must follow. These include things like dietary restrictions, marriage restrictions, not cutting one's hair at certain times, not toiling on the Sabbath, etc. The talit, or prayer shawl, which is actually pictured here. This is a picture of Moses coming down the mountain with the Ten Commandments, and he's wearing a talit. Has 613 tassels on it to remind Jews of the 613 rules that they must follow. Jews today also wear a talit during prayer services. Jews must also follow certain dietary restrictions, which are called eating kosher. Keeping kosher is not just one rule, but a variety of them. Firstly, Jewish people are not supposed to eat any pork product or shellfish. Furthermore, other types of meat have to be slaughtered and prepared in a certain way. For example, their blood has to be drained because blood is thought to contain the life force of an animal, and it's not considered appropriate to eat the blood of another animal. Also, observant Jews do not mix meat and milk in the same dish, so you can't have a meat product and a dairy product in the same dish. For example, a cheeseburger, because that mixes meat and dairy. This is not strictly biblical in origin, but comes from a passage in the Bible that says you cannot cook a calf in its mother's milk, because that was thought to be cruel. So in order to avoid breaking that rule, priests extended it to not being able to eat dairy and meat in the same dish at all. However, today really only Orthodox and conservative Jews keep kosher all the time. Reform and Reconstructionist Jews might keep kosher on holidays, but usually not throughout the year. As stated before, the difference between the Jewish denominations, which we'll talk about in more detail later on, is how strictly they follow the law. An interesting thing to note is that when we talk about more liberal or more conservative denominations, it doesn't mean doctrinally or theologically, because they all basically have the same faith, belief in one God, and the covenant with the Jewish people. The difference is how strictly they follow the law. Also, in general, Jews are supposed to be ethical examples for the rest of the world as God's chosen people. They are supposed to direct non-Jews towards God, to having faith in God, so they are required to live a higher ethical life and be a beacon of justice and faith to the world and to other people. Jews have many different rituals, as it is a religion that is focused more on practice than on belief. On a daily basis, Jews are supposed to pray 3 times, once in the morning, once at noon, and once before going to bed. Jewish men are required to wear a talit, or a prayer shawl, while they pray, which is supposed to be a remembrance of the presence of God. Although also, the reading of the Torah is a daily ritual for many Jews. It is, of course, at the center of Jewish life and religion, so studying it intensely, especially for younger Jews, is critical. Also, many Jews choose to wear a kippah or yarmulke every day as a remembrance of the presence of God above them at all time. A kippah is the hat that is shown in this picture, in the man in the middle. It's the small round hat that many Jewish men, and today women, choose to wear as a remembrance of the presence of God above them. It's required for men to wear during synagogue or temple services, but many choose to wear them all the time as a sign of devotion or holiness. Orthodox Jews also wear tefillin, which are 2 black boxes that contain scripture in them and are tied around the head and arm during prayer. And this is detailed in the video that you'll watch on Judaism. On a weekly basis, there is the Sabbath, or holy day of rest for all Jewish people. It is the 7th day of the week and is based on the Genesis creation story, in which God is said to have rested on the 7th day of creation. Since the Sabbath practice began before clocks, and since the days in Genesis were counted by the setting of the sun, the Sabbath starts at sundown on Friday and goes until sundown on Saturday. During this time, Jews usually attend a synagogue service either on Friday evening or Saturday morning. Also, they are truly required to rest and not perform any work. In the most conservative traditions, this is taken very seriously. Jews are not allowed to drive cars, operate machinery, use computers, do homework, walk long distances, make fires, cook food, or do anything else that would be technically considered work. The day is really just supposed to be devoted to relaxation, spending time with one's family, reading the Torah, and reflecting on one's spirituality and on the week preceding them and the week ahead. Again, this prescription against work is observed differently in different groups, but for the most part, in all the denominations, the Sabbath is kept and is thought of as a day of rest and relaxation, and not worrying about work or school or other matters. This is one of the most important cultural influences in our society that comes from Judaism. Jews were the first in their society to designate one day of the week for not working and for rest. In early Judaism, other societies in which they lived thought of the Jewish people as lazy for not working on this one day, but this tradition clearly has won out and has spread throughout the world, and now we have a weekend, we have part of the week that is designated to not working, and the origin of this is the Sabbath ritual in Judaism. On a yearly basis, there are several important holidays that Jews observe, and most commemorate a certain event in the history of Judaism. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and they come only 9 days apart. During this time, Jews are supposed to repent for all the sins they have committed in the previous year and ask for forgiveness from God so that they can start out the new year with a fresh start. So this is really a sort of serious, reflective time in which Jews are supposed to reflect on the year that is coming to an end, to think about the ways in which they haven't lived up to the covenant and they have, gone astray from God, ask for forgiveness, and then start the new year off with this clean, fresh start. Hanukkah is actually a minor holiday in the Jewish calendar, but it has gained much more popularity and importance because it occurs around the same time as Christmas. So it has become sort of this Christmas-like event in Jewish communities, even though theologically it's not as important of a holiday. It commemorates the rededication of the Second Temple. At some point during the history of the Second Temple, the Roman authorities took it over and dedicated it to Zeus, putting idols in the temple, which was a horrifying event to Jews that do not believe that God can be represented in any sort of physical form. They revolted and regained control of the temple, and actually also Jerusalem for a short period of time. Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the temple to Yahweh, the Jewish God, and at that time they had a menorah, which is a structure that has several candles on it, and it only had enough oil to last for 1 day, but it miraculously lasted for 8 days, and that is why in Hanukkah today it is celebrated by lighting menorah candles each night for 8 days in a row to celebrate the fact that the oil somehow miraculously lasted for that long. Passover commemorates the Exodus from Egypt. The final plague was that God brought on the Jewish people was that the angel of God killed all the firstborn males in Egypt, and the Hebrews were instructed to kill a sheep and spread the blood of it over the doors of their own homes, so that the angel of God knew to pass over those houses and not kill anyone inside. Today, this event is remembered more for the deliverance from slavery and liberation. Jews eat unleavened bread and bitter herbs to remember their hard times in Egypt as slaves, and the fact that they had to leave so quickly that their bread didn't have time to rise. So that's why they eat unleavened bread. So the Passover meal, it's celebrated as an evening meal, it's called the Passover Seder, and it involves eating many different symbolic things that are supposed to represent hard times as a slave, persecution and slavery, and the hope for liberation. And the events of the Exodus are read during that meal. In terms of life cycle, there are several important events that are commemorated in a Jewish individual's life. 8 days after birth, every Jewish male is circumcised. The act of circumcision began with Abraham, when God made his first covenant with him. Being circumcised was supposed to set the Jewish community apart from its neighbors and be a visible sign of being a part of this new covenant. This is usually a festive event and is accompanied by a party. Interestingly, this was one of the first major points of dissent between Judaism and Christianity. Paul did not want converts to Christianity. He didn't want to require them to become circumcised, because obviously it's a painful thing to go through, and many people who wanted to convert to Christianity did not want to go through the act of circumcision. But other Jewish priests disagreed and said that this was simply a part of Judaism, and Christianity began as a Jewish sect. So this is one of the many reasons that Judaism and Christianity eventually parted ways. But within Judaism, the circumcision of the male child is a very festive event, usually takes place at the home of the parents, and is followed by sort of a big party and a big meal with all your family and friends. When a boy and girl or girl reaches adolescence, or around the age of 13 or 14, they are considered to become a full member of the Jewish community and are responsible for following the Torah law. This maturing is celebrated in either a bar mitzvah for a boy or a bat mitzvah for a girl. This ceremony takes place during a synagogue service. The boy or girl usually studies for months beforehand to learn how to read the Torah in Hebrew and sing certain passages in the correct way. During synagogue services, passages from the Torah are not simply read aloud, but are sung in Hebrew, and there is a certain melody that has to be followed. So these boys and girls have to study for a long time before they are able to do this at their ceremony. Usually this process also involves meeting with one's rabbi, maybe writing an essay on Judaism and what it means to that individual, and performing some sort of volunteer service. This is also a very happy and festive occasion. There is the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah is what happens during the synagogue service, and the service itself is usually followed again by a party. Everyone's family and friends are invited, and they celebrate the sort of entering into adulthood of this young boy or young girl. In middle age, Jewish men and women are expected to marry and have children. Because this is an ethnic religion in that you are born into it, there is no ideal of celibacy. So there is no one who is set apart as not having this encouragement or requirement to marry and have children. Everyone, even rabbis, are encouraged to marry and have children, because the survival of this religion really depends on more Jewish children being born. Now, of course, there is some controversy in some Jewish communities because there's a lot of intermarrying of Jewish individuals with non-Jewish individuals. There is a strong emphasis placed on marrying within one's religion because that will ensure that the children will be raised Jewish, and Judaism as a religion based on practice really requires being raised in that tradition because there's so many educational processes that go into the living out of this tradition that starts at a very young age. So there is a tension today between more conservative or traditional Jewish individuals who still consider marrying within the religion very important, and more moderate, liberal, or progressive Jewish individuals who do not consider that as important. At death, certain rituals are performed. Jews are supposed to face death in a resolute and sober fashion. Funeral services include words that the righteous will be resurrected and mention of the world to come, but again, there is no developed theology in Judaism that explains how or when this will occur or what the afterlife is exactly like. Traditional Jews will cover the mirrors in their home to show grieving and perform the Kaddish, which is a special prayer, a special morning prayer that is performed every day for a year after the death. So there are some certain rituals that are supposed to go along with the death of a loved one. Since the time that the Hebrew people lost control of Israel, they have always been a persecuted minority wherever they have lived. So for the most part, up until the Renaissance, Jews were isolationist in their relations to the society at large. Some of this was by choice, but a large part of it was that they were banned from participating in greater society. In Europe, for example, Jews were not allowed to go to the same schools as Christians, they couldn't hold certain jobs, they couldn't go to non-Jewish colleges, and were often forced to live in ghettos or walled areas of the cities so that the city could impose a curfew on them and lock them in at night. Jews were very much victimized for hundreds of years in European society, and they really just had their own society wherever they lived that was completely separate from the non-Jewish society. Today, different branches have varying degrees of integration with secular society. Orthodox Jews are still largely isolationist, mostly because of the strict observance of the Torah law, which really does prevent them from participating in many aspects of secular life. They have to eat they remain kosher, so eating can become an issue in terms of what restaurants they can eat at, making sure that other people are preparing food for them in the proper way in kosher style. They wear distinctive clothing. They follow much stricter social life, things like that. Conservative Jews are mostly integrationists. They'll usually favor going to Jewish schools and marrying a Jewish partner. Reform and Reconstructionist Jews, we could say, are fully integrated into secular society, though they still maintain a strong Jewish identity and cultural heritage. In terms of who has authority within the religion, rabbis came to be the authority figures after priests had really lost their roles following the destruction of the Second Temple. So during the Temple period of Judaism, the religious authority was known as a priest, and it was someone who was responsible for taking care of the temple and who knew how to perform the proper rituals and sacrifices at the temples. But once there was no longer a central temple, the role of the priest really just kind of went away, and this new figure known as the rabbi came to be the predominant religious authority within Judaism. There was no place for the priests who knew how to perform these rituals because they could only be performed at that one temple. So a new type of authority figure emerged, the rabbi, which means teacher. The rabbi is someone who is not really set apart from the rest of the congregation. They still have families, but they have just gone through more extensive study of the Torah, the Talmud, and Jewish practices, history, and texts. There is no official ordination process, although rabbis usually attend yeshivas, which are Jewish schools that train rabbis in the particular tradition that they want to become a rabbi in. Being a rabbi is a full-time job, and they are attached to a certain synagogue or temple and in charge of running it, which includes Jewish education programs, holiday celebrations, weekly Sabbath services, etc. So this figure of the teacher became more important as learning about the Torah, Jewish history, and Jewish practice became the center of Jewish life. Now we'll talk a bit more in depth about the various denominations within Judaism. First, there is Orthodox Judaism, which is the most conservative and strict in terms of its adherence to the law. It's interesting to note, however, that something called Orthodox Judaism did not exist until some of the other denominations started to break away and become more liberal. Because before the 1800s, or before this time, everyone who was Jewish was an Orthodox Jew. So it's really the most traditional way of being Jewish. Previous to the other denominations coming about, there was no other way to be Jewish than Orthodox. So Orthodox Judaism came about in the 1800s, but it really is sort of the most traditional and conservative way of Judaism that has existed since the beginning of temple-based Judaism. Reform Judaism began in the 1800s in Germany when a Jewish intellectual who was influenced by the Enlightenment and humanist ideas, called for Jews to integrate into Christian society. He wanted Jews to take a more active role, socialize with non-Jews, and emphasize what they shared in common with Christians, as opposed to what was the differences between them. He also said that following all of the Torah law was no longer necessary because that was only applicable in older times, and that we needed to adapt those laws to modern times and to carry the spirit of the law without having to carry out the letter of the law. So this is the first Jewish denomination to break away from what came to be known as Orthodox Judaism. It comes about in Europe and is really saying that they don't have to follow all of Torah law anymore. The world today is radically different from the one in which these laws were created, so it's possible to live out the spirit of the law in terms of having faith in one God, following Jewish practices, prayer, living an ethical life, but it's no longer necessary to follow every single one of those laws. Some of them simply don't apply to our modern world. Many European Jews embraced this new form of Judaism as a way to enter European society, enjoy the best of what European society had to offer, and not to be so segregated and persecuted. For many, however, they agreed with some of the ideas of Reform Judaism, but thought it was a bit extreme, and this becomes the birth of Conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism does embrace progress and change, However, it still takes the law very seriously and seeks to find justification within the law to reform certain aspects of Judaism and participate in certain parts of secular society. So conservative Judaism is kind of a midway point between Orthodox, the most conservative, and Reform, which at that time was the most liberal. They do agree that you can start to adapt and update some of the laws within the Torah, but they don't agree with simply getting rid of some of the laws. They think that they still all have to be followed, but we can reinterpret how we follow them today. Reconstructionist Judaism is a much more recent form of Judaism. It began as a form of Judaism for Jewish men and women who did not necessarily believe in the Jewish religion or take the Hebrew Bible to be divinely inspired, or even follow many of the Jewish practices, but still wanted to embrace their Jewish heritage and Jewish culture. For them, Judaism is more of a culture than a religion. Many Reconstructionist Jews could be agnostic or even atheist, but they still may support Israel, study the Hebrew Bible as a great literary document, and participate in observing Jewish holidays. So Reconstructionist Jews are largely secular in that many of them do not believe in the religious or theological aspect of Judaism, but they still identify as Jews. They may still celebrate Jewish holidays, they may keep kosher at some times, and Judaism for them is very much a part of their identity and their heritage, but not necessarily the religion that they follow. Today, one of the modern challenges to Judaism is who is considered Jewish. Judaism means very different things to different people. To some it's a religion, to some it's an ethnicity, the nation of Israel, a culture, a history, etc. What makes a person Jewish? Typically, you are considered Jewish if your mother was Jewish, but that's not a very exact criteria. Once, when Jews were separated from society and everyone was a part of what is now called Orthodox Judaism, it was pretty clear who was Jewish and who was not Jewish. If you practiced the Jewish religion, you were Jewish. But now with the rise of secular Judaism, individuals who embrace their Judaism as more of a culture and a heritage, but not a religious belief system, those boundaries have been blurred. So this has definitely become a challenge to modern Judaism, is how do we define what Judaism is, since it's so many different things to different people. Also, we now have a Jewish nation, the nation of Israel. Israel itself also wrestles with its own identity, especially because it was begun as a Jewish state. That's what it's supposed to be. But again, what this means is hotly debated within Israel. Only a minority of Israelis are actually observant religious Jews. The majority are secular Jews. So Israel itself also struggles with this identity of being a Jewish state. Does it mean that everyone within the government has to be a religious Jew? Does it mean that it's more about their shared history, shared culture, shared heritage? This is also a debate that is very relevant in Israeli culture today. In terms of experience, the overwhelming majority is that of the numinous experience. We have one high God who expects his people to follow his commandments, pray to him, and show gratitude to him. In return, this God will provide protection, descendants, and a promised land to the Jewish people. God is understood as wholly other and wholly transcendent. There are no visual images of God allowed in Judaism. Any depiction of God is considered an idol and cannot be worshipped. That is why God appears in various forms in the Bible, such as a burning bush or just a voice, because God has no physical form within Judaism. God is considered omnipotent, which is all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnipresent, so present everywhere. He is definitely a God before which you would tremble in awe and fascination and have this numinous experience. And Jews mostly experience through prayer or through reading of the Torah, but many consider following the Torah also as a way of being constantly in the presence of God. When one follows the Torah strictly, which is the 613 mitzvot, every action that one does is done consciously to please God. So many Jews who live according to Torah law say that living in this way makes them feel that they are constantly in the presence of God, because every action in their lives is God-oriented. However, there is a distinct mystical strain in Judaism, which is really only a minority strain, called Kabbalah. Kabbalah was a form of Judaism that gained popularity in the Middle Ages and interpreted the Torah as being written in code. and that there was actually a secret message contained in the Torah that only those who knew the code could understand. It encouraged mystical interpretation of Scripture and mystical practices that it thought could enable the individual to personally experience God. It largely died out after the Middle Ages, but recently has become very popular again. Today, many celebrities are interested in Kabbalah. Madonna is a Kabbalist, and several other famous individuals. So you may have heard of this type of mystical Jewish strain before.